Welcome to part 2 of our discussion with the master's students of Durham University's School of Governance and International Affairs. We are continuing our discussion on the challenges facing modern UN peacekeeping, and today we are joined by a high-ranking, now retired UN official and diplomat, a man who has worked in conflict areas around the world and who is still very much in the fight. I am not sure if he will ever really retire. He's a friend of the podcast, also a senior director and someone who has retired at the rank of Assistant Secretary General. A very warm welcome to Peter de Clercq. And before I continue, just a small caveat that unfortunately schedules did not align, and so Peter was not able to attend the course at Durham to present. However, he did agree to answer the questions, which was very kind, and thank you to the students for sending them. And I will just be the medium to present those questions today. Thank you. Thanks, Peter, for joining us again. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. And our first question from our students from Durham University: in both Somalia and Haiti, we have seen an evolution of peace operations towards regional organizations or multinational coalitions taking the lead. And do you think this is a change for the better? And how do you see this developing both in those countries and more broadly in global peacekeeping?
Thanks, Tony. It's a really good question, and it's a very relevant question. It'd be important to start by turning to why we go for regional peacekeeping. And unfortunately, I believe that it's still too much because, this is seen as a budget peacekeepers. It's often done for the wrong reasons. We move to this modality because it's significantly cheaper than a full blue helmeted mission. It's just a little bit easier to do in terms of obtaining the mandate. So I don't think we necessarily do it for the right reasons. For me, the importance of moving more towards regional peacekeeping or choosing that modality would be because there is a political role and a political will on the part of the region to get engaged in peace operations. As I was saying before, this is not what I've seen in terms of my experience at senior levels in UN peacekeeping missions and in UN circles more general. I've seen that when these regional presences are being established, and whether that is in Darfur or UNAMID or whether it is in Somalia or in Sudan, otherwise, you see that the conditions under which the peacekeepers operate, both administratively and physically, are just way below par. I don't think any bilateral military outfit would consider to be operating under those conditions, and particularly those living conditions. But, that seems to be good enough sometimes for the Africans to be pushed in that role. And I don't find that right. Worse than even that, if it's possible, would be, let's say, the support and, let's say, the terms of reference and the modus operandi in which they are engaging. And with that, I mean, if you look at how, for instance, their logistical chains are set up, they are considered to be, good enough to fight their way through to the front line rather than, for instance, have the proper logistical backup simply because it's more expensive. And for instance, if you look at Somalia, where the AMISOM forces had to basically supply their frontline troops through controlled area by Al-Shabaab were being attacked during this supply, whereas if you would have had an airlift, if you would have helicopter capability, the risks to be taken by those troops would have been much less. I don't think these things are correct and are right. So that's not the right way to deploy regional peacekeepers. So then, as I was saying before, it's important that the region not only is seen as the one that providing the cheap troops, but also has a political role to play. So it takes also political ownership for solutions that these peacekeeping missions then pursue. And in the case of Somalia, or also what's going to be set up now in Haiti, this is going to be a similar kind of outfit. You have first the political work being done by the United Nations. You have a political mission. Then you have the African peacekeepers. And then, because again, the African outfit is not equipped to do the logistics, the UN sets up a separate mission for logistics support. And we've seen this in the Sahel. We're going to see it in Haiti. We certainly saw it in Somalia. So you have three separate missions operating in a compartmentalized manner, having different command structures all the way up to the top levels, And they're not supposed to provide one product, one piece product. And I don't think that's the right way to go. And this is how we increasingly have dealt with regional peacekeeping. So we got these support missions that are part of the support structure in the United Nations Secretariat, which is different from the political Department for Political Affairs, which is different from the African Union structure on which these troops then deploy. It won't take a genius to see that that's not the best way to go. And it will also, already show you're going to have major coordination problems that are therefore going to result in less effectiveness, probably higher losses, higher risks. So for me, we need to get all this right if we are to go more systematically for regional peacekeeping. And I think it is almost a necessary direction for us to take, because we see at the top level in the United Nations a dysfunctionality at Security Council level, whereby mandates are very difficult to get, blue helmet mandates even more difficult. So then the natural sort of default option will become more and more the regional peacekeeping operations. Going back again to this lack of coordination, I find a dramatic thing, especially in view of the fact that after the Hippo and Brahimi report, we are being told as the international community and the UN in particular to work in a more integrated manner. And we see the opposite. Institutionally, we see the opposite actually happening. Same, of course, for the non-sort of peace actors on the UN side. We are also being told as humanitarians and developmentals to work as one, to an integrated way, and to include also the peace efforts in our humanitarian development peace nexus work. So this structural setup is really not conducive to a comprehensive and integrated approach and solution. I don't have the answer, but I certainly know that our current setup with chapter 6, 7, and 8 peace operations is not the way to go. We need to rethink this. We need to go back to basics. And that basics also needs to take into account, and I'll probably talk about that later on in the podcast, about the lack of political will globally, and particularly the international disrespect for international law and international institutions. So, sorry, it's a bit of a drawn-out answer, but it's not an easy one to answer because the current conditions are not conducive for it. I think it's a necessary way to go, and a lot of things need to happen before we can confidently move more in this direction and use regional peacekeeping more systematically.
No, I think you're right. It's a good answer. And also you had mentioned some important elements there, like the current chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8 is not maybe fit for purpose. And it does, what you mentioned about the troops and then the political part reminds me of something that Kofi Annan said, something like, when you deploy a small force, they are something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing, they're too small to be invisible, or it's too small not to be noticed, or too big not to be noticed, shall I say, and they're too small to be effective. And you sit with a bit of a paradox over there that it's a token being sent out, and you had mentioned that about governments being happy to deploy them, but then kind of the political vacuum still exists. And I want to build on that a little bit to ask, and this is from the Durham students again, from Durham University, what do you think the future of peacekeeping looks like? What can be saved and what needs to change?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I don't want to become philosophical, but I think before we answer that question, we really need to look at the international environment and therefore the political will to move in one direction or the other. And what you see, of course, at the moment is that increasingly international cooperation is being undermined, that increasingly countries in their foreign policy are being very much sort of inward looking at their self-interest. And I think that is the problem, but at the same time, that's also the answer for our change in direction to take in terms of international cooperation. So, I don't know if this trend towards, self-interest, country first approach, if this is something structural, irreversible, but sure as hell at the moment, I don't think we have another choice but to take advantage somehow or use that trend. So if these inward-looking or nationally owned approaches are going to be the norm, then maybe there's also, referring to the previous question, much more of a role for the region that sees it in its self-interest to therefore take a bigger role. So the future of peacekeeping and more broadly of international cooperation, because peacekeeping for me is not just a matter of silencing the guns, but it is also of looking at underlying causes of building institutional arrangements at the national level to state construction and reconstruction, to make sure that this conflict goes away structurally, sustainably, and that it's replaced by a different reality, right? And again, if we take that as a national interest, then we could make the case that not pursuing sort of that national interest would be also against the interest of the international community. Not empowering a country, not finding solutions at the local level is against the interest of the international community as well. So I think this starting point I would like to take. So multilateralism needs to be more aligned, if you wish, with national interests, and what's interesting, of course, is that if you look at very highly integrated and regulated environments like the European Union at the multilateral level, then you see that issues that before were very clear and there was clear common ground, even those areas seem to be played a part. So it's not going to be that easy to really again find that common ground in this populist context in which we are, where it is so popular at the moment to go for this is not in our interest, this is not in our national interest, is not in line with our traditional way of thinking. Going to be tough. So for better or for worse, I think we need to therefore go back to the design process of missions, as we have known them over the past few decades. I was already referring to a critical look at these peacekeeping chapters, the chapter 6, 7, and 8. We also need to reflect more broadly on the lack of respect of international law and the role of international institutions. And whereas the UN needs to do much more reform to be relevant and fit for purpose, I believe we should think smaller. So when we're looking at peacemaking and peacekeeping efforts, we should be much more reliant on operations that rely on coalitions of the willing. There are some mechanisms in the UN, such as the Uniting for Peace resolution, that somehow do give some space there, although that's been actively sabotaged by some of the key Security Council members for very obvious reasons. I think we need to go in that direction. We need to find a number of principled countries with political will to play an effective role in the international cooperation. And you can think of some of the emerging donors and emerging international players. Think of Turkey, think of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, who do want to play a role in terms of building a more stable international environment, who have the right ambitions that we can work with as international institutions to reshape how we make peace, how we bring stability to regions. So smaller coalitions backed up by international mandates, that could be General Assembly mandates, for instance, is very helpful and in fact almost indispensable in the beginning if some of those new actors or some of those coalition members bring resources to the fore. And this is, again, I live in Saudi Arabia. I see that ambition, right? I mean, some people may say for the wrong reasons. In a sense, it really doesn't matter. You have a country that really wants to profile itself in a positive way, that wants to contribute internationally, that wants to promote a set of international principles or things that we have agreed upon as global community and want to be recognized for that. So let's work with that, rather than being old-fashioned. It's not bad to be principled, but being principled to the extent that it even harms ourselves and what we're trying to accomplish here. So I see opportunities there. There are other countries that also are emerging, playing that role, even in Europe. Although, as I was saying, Europe as such is at this point in time not sufficiently united to, be a bloc and be an alternative for this lack of international respect for international law and principles. So that's the direction I see things going for, let's say, the future of peace operations and even peacekeeping and peacemaking. I could see in a fairly sort of short term a major role for those type of players, and particularly if you look again at the Gulf equation in places like Sudan, but why not in places like Gaza, Syria? Certainly there is the interest, and I think we will see that major role being rather happily outsourced by countries that are disengaging and that are now not willing to waste, so to speak, their precious resources to operations like that.
Quick pulse check. Are we on target? Drop a review on your app and hit subscribe on YouTube. Every click helps to keep the momentum going. Let's move ahead.
A very comprehensive answer, Peter. And I take your point that, the global order is changing. And where we were 30 years ago with peacekeeping, looking at the developed, and I don't like the term, but you know what I mean, the developed world, if I can put it like that, versus the global south. we now see a change about who's contributing. Also, the power players seems to be changing. And you mentioned this in our pre-talk, just the international order, the rules-based system is just not where it was. I mean, if you look at the 50s and, whereas, the US president at that time could just say, that's quite enough about the Suez crisis. And that effectively ended, the French and British invasion with Israeli support. And, so came in the first peacekeeping. But, forget about the history, but you know what I mean? There was power in this, and it felt like peacekeeping evolved from that, as opposed to now, I know you've written extensively about it, this cookie cutter or this kind of template-based approach, which, and you've hinted at it now also, that the whole thing needs some redesign. And one of the things that I want us to touch on, just again from our master's students at Durham doing this CPD course, another strong or piercing question they've put in there, given the challenges faced with sexual violence and sexual exploitation and abuse more broadly by peacekeepers in Haiti, do you believe that the subsequent UN response was adequate?
Yeah, again, excellent question. And I'm going to be as honest as I can. Obviously, having spent almost 4 decades in the UN system, I've seen more than probably I should have. And I've seen a lot of things that do not make me very proud of the United Nations as a system. But also, let's not forget what the United Nations system is. And particularly when we go to peace operations, how these are composed, how these are functioning, what the modalities are. To be as transparent as I can, I obviously served at senior levels in Haiti, the Great Lakes and Democratic Republic of Congo in particular, and in Somalia. Is the UN response adequate to sexual violence and exploitation? Of course, that is a resounding no. And again, I'm the last person to give excuses, but let's also understand how peacekeeping today and peacemaking today functions and how troops are being positioned there and under what conditions. So troops basically, remain part of a national institution, their national defense setup, although they do enter the UN. I have seen in more than one cases that the command line still very much passes by the UN level and goes to the capitals. And that can result in some fairly tainted responses by peacekeepers in terms of what they do and what they do not do. And I'm not even saying of the specifics of what they do, but where they get engaged, where they do not get engaged, where they will take the UN command, where they will not take the UN command. And that is within existing operations. So you already have a problem there. Although formally, of course, all these people all of a sudden fall under the UN, start wearing a blue helmet. In reality, there are problems in terms of their lines of command. That's already one. Beyond that, of course, when something goes wrong, when there are disciplinary issues, for instance, how do these get addressed? Now, the UN has a very limited capability of disciplining. So basically, when you do something wrong, even if it's something really bad, you get sent home. And then it is completely depending on the troop contributing country, whether people will be prosecuted or not, whether they will be disciplined or not. And again, I've seen on many occasions that people simply do get sent home and that it stops right there. In Haiti, I don't want to remember the times that I had to sign paternity cases to hold accountable individuals coming from troop contributing countries who had gone home after leaving offspring behind. I don't want to remember how many times, but I can tell you it was extremely regular. And what happens then? It probably depends on the decency of the individual or of the willingness of the country where they are going back to, whether anything happens. I've seen worse stuff than this. I've seen much worse stuff, which I, at this point in time, do not want to get into. But almost invariably, the response will be for these people to go home and to be put on some kind of blacklist that in a future operation, they will not be able to serve as UN peacekeepers. It doesn't only go to individual misbehavior. And I want to give the example, and this is very sensitive, of the cholera, for instance, in Haiti. I think very few people will still believe that the UN had nothing to do with the spreading of cholera in Haiti. Yet for years, and this when I was at a very senior level in the UN, we were not, let me say, allowed to openly say that, because the accountability issue here kicked in. There were a number of lawsuits in the United States that had been brought by the diaspora to the tune of well over $3 billion that would basically hold the UN to account for the cholera issue. And the UN, in terms of, its response, decided that legally it could not afford to be held accountable because that would have been the end of peacekeeping. This would have had to come out of the UN's own resources. And as you know, there are no such things. It all comes from member countries. You see, not only the troop contributing countries have a problem with accountability, but in peace operations, the UN itself has an issue. And that's very interesting and certainly something that needs to be studied much more, goes to the issue of whether the UN in advance can be held accountable for any kind of, non-intended effects of peacekeeping operations. And I gave one example, but if the UN indeed could be held responsible for instance, going in a robust manner and then being held accountable, how much appetite would there be to go into peacekeeping operations? Now, my point in the case of Haiti when I was there was, and that was my advice to headquarters, which obviously was not being followed. Well, I think we can assume that the UN, having diplomatic status in terms of its presence would somehow, be not exonerated, but would certainly therefore, could not be pursued legally. And therefore, we could take accountability as long as we dealt with those side effects. I mean, with those unintended sort of fallouts. And the cholera was one example. That was not the choice taken by headquarters, and they probably are smarter than I am in this regard. But I did feel that UN peacekeeping operation can only function if somehow there is some type of acknowledged safeguard that, things can happen if we are in a robust mandate, and therefore that, we would address those, but that we would not be taken to a court, in civil court for this, right? It's an interesting question, and it's not a question that I think has been thought through. Everybody's tiptoeing around this collateral damage question, but it is something that certainly requires more attention. As it stands now, at any rate, I mean, blue helmet peacekeeping operations are very unlikely to take place in the future, in my opinion. So it will largely be outsourced to either regional organizations or coalitions of the willing. But I think the question of accountability stands. I mean, we need to think this through very carefully. Because, as I said, it could be an absolute blockage on any effort to have a multinational or international force intervening in a situation where this is absolutely required. So, look, again, it's not a very clear and straightforward answer. We need to think this through much more carefully. Right now, the systems are certainly not in place to hold people accountable. A lot of things are happening that are utterly unacceptable, and the UN needs to get troops from contributing countries, and it can, beggars can't be choosers. So the UN has limited capability of really enforcing discipline, of conditioning the deployment of forces against a much higher level of accountability.
Thanks for that, Peter. Again, a very difficult subject, and I think you've given a lot of context and depth to that, because sitting on the outside is quite linear. What are you doing about it? And as you said, you gave the answer straight up from the start. It's a no, and that's a very strong position, but you've given that depth behind it. Another perhaps complicated or maybe tricky subject is the use of intelligence, and this came through from the class too. Do you think the UN has the right relationship with using and gathering intelligence within its missions? And if not, what do you think needs to change?
Intelligence is incredibly important. You need to understand underlying causes, and whether that is on the peace side or the humanitarian or development side. If you want to bring solutions, you need to understand the underlying causes. And many of these underlying causes are going to be rather smelly. They're not going to be very pleasant to look at. And most importantly, of course, many of these underlying causes, the state in which you operate is going to have a role in it, and not always a positive one. And I'm putting it very mildly. At the same time, of course, and we've seen that, as part of the more solutions-oriented approach that we are now taking on humanitarian and development issues, there is no solution, no sustainable solution without the state taking ownership or leadership. There is none. I mean, there's no way the UN can take over, or the international community can take over a country and run it in perpetuity, or educate the government, what the standards should be. The state itself needs to take full responsibility and accountability. So that's why intelligence, understanding underlying causes, understanding the context is incredibly important. Now, many countries including some that themselves may not always have had the best intentions toward their own parts of their own populations, understood that too. So as UN reform sort of took place over the decades and became with more integrated approaches, and particularly the concept of integrated missions, and we're looking at the Brahimi or the Hippo reports, we saw very strong pushback on this need for intelligence capability within the UN system. There were a number of countries, and I'm not going to name them, that were explicitly sort of against the UN developing any type of this kind of capability. And especially today's world, where, to me, neutrality and impartiality are pretty much off the cliff. I think this just, to explicitly pursue this would be an absolute manslaughter, right? So what do we do in the UN to get better intelligence analysis in particular? Well, we often set up these more information management entities. We have JOCs, Joint Operational Centers. We also rely to a significant extent on the generic UN staff security capacity, which is the UN DSS. So these are former military, police, people who are then made responsible for the security of individual UN staff, in particular international staff. And of course, they, in their work, de facto, do quite a bit of intelligence gathering, if you call it that, and they cooperate particularly with law enforcement and military realities in the countries where we work. I think, as I was saying before, that pursuing a more explicit need for improved intelligence and analytical capacity in the UN is a total non-starter at this point in time politically. Then your best way is, as a chief of mission or a senior person in a UN operation, whether that has a mission in it or not, is to basically have a forum where you have people that deal with information management, quasi-intelligence function, although you can never call it that, by bringing those together on a regular basis, and then having a limited number of analysts in your office as the UN Supremo or the number 2, as in my case, and working with that. Come on with an analysis. A good place to position this would be in risk analysis. Risk analysis is more and more a popular feature in the UN, not just on the humanitarian development side, but also increasingly, I think, on the peace side. So if you have some risk analysts that draw on the information that we gather around us, whether it comes out of intelligence or increasingly out of humanitarian development sources as well. Because let's not forget, what are we there for as UN? We're there to support the people, not just the state. We support the people. It's we the people, it's not we the state. As much information as we can get from grassroots in terms of our analysis and understanding what's really going on is really important. Humanitarians in particular have often this link with civil society, with local NGOs. And I think that's where a lot of quote unquote intelligence that's relevant to the UN and to the UN's purpose is being gathered. So involve them in terms of the information management and analysis. And as I said, bring it together at the highest levels within the UN system, but not in a formal setting. Be very careful, because the moment some of the key political international stakeholders get hold of that, you could be in serious trouble at the New York level. This is how I see it, but particularly, and we don't do that sufficiently, rely much more on those UN entities within the team that have penetration at the grassroots level. And I would say humanitarians have an enormous amount of intelligence that's often not realized. They're often reluctant, of course, to share it because they are a bit shy of working with uniformed UN staff. But I think as a UN manager and pursuing an integrated and principled approach, I think this is a way to take. And this is how we get the best out of our information gathering and intelligence effort. And so again, it's not a straightforward answer. This is what you do, 1, 2, 3. Just restructure this, set up a new structure or department in your office, but organize yourself better, act with discretion. And also, and that's one last thing I need to say about this, protect your sources. Because the more you're going to be relying on civil society and civilians, and those are the people that you serve, the more they potentially, which also could become targets of unscrupulous state and non-state actors.
And we've seen that very much, Peter, more in a conventional and counterinsurgency context in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq and so on, where people who were I don't know how to put this in delicate terms, but with really the invading force or of NATO and allies, how many of them were left to their own defenses after the withdrawals from there. So that last point on protecting your sources is so important, and intelligence. I can completely understand, and I've mentioned it myself. It's so sensitive because it's always linked to state interests, to national organizations, international organizations, and so on. But I think the way you've answered that was very good, showing the nuance and how it can be used in that peacekeeping context. The last one I know is a subject close to your heart, and this question comes again from our students and says, how should UN peacekeeping balance local ownership, legitimacy, trust with international human rights and governance standards, especially when dealing with non-state actors?
I've said this probably a few times. I mean, we are in a time that makes it very difficult to look forward positively and confidently towards a future where peace is, and just peace and sustainable peace is going to be on the horizon. Global opinions, perceptions have shifted. And, if we give it a name, the Trump administration has moved the goalposts, I would say to the whole width of the field in this regard. We've seen pretty much the end of neutrality and impartiality. Look at issues that we took for granted just a few months ago in terms of, for instance, the world's opinion on the Middle East and what needed to be done there. And we know that we are in a very different place today. Now, we come from an era, and so I'm old enough to come from an era whereby, as a former humanitarian, it was considered to be totally appropriate, understood, and correct for me to deal with very bad people in order to access the people that I'm supposed to serve as a humanitarian or development actor. And there was no issue when I worked in Afghanistan, when I worked previously in Somalia, when I worked in the Congo or Rwanda, Burundi. If you want to get to your people, the people that you are supposed to serve, the people that you try to save their life from, you're going to have to negotiate with what the Americans popularly would refer to as the bad guys. And this self-evident issue for humanitarians is no longer on the cards. You can't just assume that to carry out your work, you have to be impartial, you have to be neutral, and you don't have to like people that you deal with. And so the people certainly I dealt with, I would have preferred to wash my hands the moment I shook them with them. But that's just the only way to get there. This you can't take for granted. We've seen increasingly, I would say, over the past few years that certain donors in terms of humanitarian development work were limiting their interventions and your ability to develop programs to those areas where parties that they considered to be politically correct, where they were functioning or in charge. And so that independence, let alone humanitarian, let's say the humanitarian imperative, that is really dead, and reminiscing about it or complaining that it is, wrong, or we have to go back to international solidarity, I think that's just, at this point in time, that's useless. So again, I go back to something that I said before, bringing back these issues, you mentioned local ownership, legitimacy, trust with international human rights and governance standards. Unless you link this to state interest and national interest of a country that we're trying to work in or work for, I think any other direction at this point in time is not going to be effective. So how do you bring this back to the state's responsibility and accountability toward its own citizens? And that may be actually, for even very populist thinking governments, quite a palatable way to go. Look, this is their country. These are their people. They are responsible. But that doesn't mean you can do with your people what you want. There are certain principles to be adhered to. And as much as human rights is no longer popular, and even organizations like ICRC are having a hard time keeping their head above the water, surely it's in nobody's interest if a country systematically clamps down on its own people, discriminates against certain groups. It doesn't help the stability for a country, and certainly not the stability of the immediate environment of that country, the region, and even the broader world as such. So going back to this, how is it in the interest of a country to be more adherent to international standards? How is it in the interest of a country to make peace with itself? I think that is probably the way for the UN, at least for now, until we reach a point whereby we say, look, international solidarity is a common good, is a way to go. And again, I come from an era not so very long ago that these things were taken for granted, that there were so many things that we didn't have to argue about, I don't have to give the example, but I think you'll understand that, I'm not even going back as far as the time when we thought of a new international economic order, where in everybody's interest to have an international balance and to reduce the number of have-nots, because that was not in the interest even of the haves. I'm not even going there, but in how far countries, need to be more empowered to be at peace with themselves. And that may be a way to go to slowly starting to convince, very inward-looking, selfish sort of actors of taking more of an interest in international cooperation, peace operations, and peacemaking in particular.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. It's been a pleasure being with you today. It's really been a masterclass again. And I think everyone at Durham will also be sharing this and listening and taking to heart all that what you've said. I think they will be writing some academic papers, but for the wider audience, I think that message holds, and it'll help to inform our current understanding of a very difficult situation. So once again, a big thank you from all of us.
You're very welcome, Tony, anytime.
That wraps up part 2 of our discussion on the challenges of modern UN peacekeeping. And once again, a big thank you to Peter for joining us. A big thank you to the students of Durham University, to Anne and to Tara. And thank you to everyone for listening.